So we can begin this this last and eighth session in this particular module on transforming problems. We can begin by a brief recitation of the mantra of compassion, Om Mani Padme Hum, and use the time and the energy that we put into reciting this mantra to cultivate as broad and as expansive a compassionate motivation as we can for the activities that we're going to engage in this evening. Om Mani Padme Hum, 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 Om Mani Padme Hum. So this evening we're concluding the this time spent on the 8 verses or 8 stanzas of thought transformation, and up to this point the first 7 stanzas have been focusing on the method aspect of the path, meaning the cultivation of the compassionate bodhicitta and the various activities that arise from that compassionate motivation. Pardon me. And the first 2 lines of the 8th stanza, in a sense, summarize or give advice concerning the method aspect of the path. In an alternate translation, which I'll hand out as part of these as part of the information I'll be giving later on, an alternate translation to this 8th stanza. The first 2 lines are like this. May all this remain undefiled by the stains of the 8 mundane concerns. May all this, meaning may all of the practices outlined in the first 7 stanzas, may all this remain undefiled by the stains of the 8 mundane concerns. The 8 mundane concerns. Okay? So what this is saying, according to a commentary by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, is that as we engage in these altruistic practices, for example, exchanging oneself for others, giving the victory to others and taking on the defeat of oneself, and all of the many, many other practices, both specifically mentioned in the first 7 stanzas and implied and present in the other teachings on the cultivation of bodhicitta. While we do that, while we engage in those practices or cultivate those thoughts, we should try to keep our mind as free as possible from the contamination of the so-called 8 worldly concerns. The 8 worldly concerns. Now this list of 8 has been given out earlier, and it's known by several names. Well, there's obviously the 8 worldly concerns, the 8 mundane affairs of this life. Sometimes they're even referred to as the 8 worldly dharmas. But here, dharma shouldn't be understood in the terms in meaning teachings. It's not the 8 worldly teachings. That's not what dharma means in that context. There, dharma simply means phenomena. because that's one of the other meanings of the word dharma. Okay? So all of these, whether we call them the eight worldly concerns, the eight mundane feelings, the eight worldly dharmas, whatever name we give to them, they're referring to these attitudes that predominate in so much of our life, in so much of our thought, in so much of our action. And these eight are divided into two lists of four, in other words, two pairs. And we can take the first as an example. The first pair is gain and loss. Gain and loss. So what this means, what in worldly or mundane concern is that when we experience a gain, we become elated. But when we experience loss, we become deflated or depressed. In other words, our mind, instead of being even and being able to accept the positive things that happen to us with equanimity and the negative things that happen to us with equanimity, our mind becomes like a dry leaf in the wind. There's no stability to such a leaf. If the wind blows this way, the leaf willy-nilly goes that way. And if the wind changes direction, then the leaf, without any ability to kind of determine its own movement, goes whichever way the wind is blowing. So this describes a mundane, worldly, ordinary mind, a mind which is elated when good things happen to it, such as experiencing some kind of gain or being praised or having some other positive type of experience, and becomes depressed or saddened or deflated when the opposite, when we experience some sort of loss. Now, of course, we might think, well, it's natural. If something good happens, I get happy, and if something bad happens, I'm not happy about it. That's just natural. But how we have to look a little bit further into that. It isn't simply liking what's good and not liking what is not good. It's not simply that. It's having our basic peace of mind disturbed by the events that happen in our life. So we grasp after positive experiences. Maybe positive isn't such a good word to use there. Positive is too good a word to use. But experiences that accord with our likes and our dislikes. You know, so we turn on the radio and we hear a little bit of good news, you know, that the stock we were holding, you know, went up a few points, and we become overjoyed and we start dancing around, you know. Then later in the afternoon we hear it falls a few points and we're unconsolable, right? So this is a sign of a unstable, fickle mind, which doesn't simply like it when things are going the way we want and doesn't like it when things are not going the way. It's not just simply that. It's losing its center. It's losing its stability. And when we look in our lives, or certainly when I look in mine, I see the extent to which we fall under the influence of such worldly dharmas, of such worldly concerns. Now, just to round out the list, it is in another handout, but just for the sake of being a little bit complete here, one is experiences of like and dislike, of gaining and losing, praise and blame, fame and disgrace. And you can, I'll repeat it one more time, but you can get this list in many places. It's often spoken about in the Dharma teachings. Here, the Dalai Lama lists them as like and dislike, gaining and losing, praise and blame, fame and disgrace. Mm-hmm. In previous modules, I spoke about the ordinary way in which we live our lives as being very similar to a scavenger hunt, that we live our life trying to collect as many likable experiences and getting rid of as many experiences that we don't like, as if we were in some kind of scavenger hunt, as if we were going to win a prize at the end of our life. I had these many nice experiences. I had 4,322 nice experiences and only 3,981 bad experiences. So my life was a success. But it obviously doesn't work out that way, does it? Especially as we have that unstable mind, we could have 20 great experiences in a row, feeling really over the moon. And then because that itself is a sign of an unstable mind, then when we have that one negative experience, that one experience of loss or insult or whatever it might be, even someone, as the Dalai Lama gives in one of his examples, giving something to someone and that person neglecting to say thank you to us. The absence of that thank you could send us into depression. Right? Because we're not relying on ourselves for any sense of stability, any sense of continuity, any sense of real deep understanding or steadiness to our life. But our happiness or unhappiness, we're now giving over to others. We're kind of giving it over to the universe. Make my day, right? Turn on the weather report. It's going to be sunny today, so we're happy. No, it's going to be, I'm sorry, it's a mistake. It's actually going to be cloudy today. Oh, so now I'm unhappy. Right? So it's like we're hostages to this changeable universe. Right? We're giving over the responsibility for our own happiness to a changeable universe filled with changeable human beings, right? And changeable, impermanent possessions. So, in one of His Holiness's commentaries to these first two lines of this verse, he says, okay, now, at this point, we're, by the 8th stanza, we're somehow or other dedicated to practicing the Dharma, the Mahayana Dharma, which means the cultivation of the bodhicitta, engaging in actions for the benefit of others. So he gives an example, which is actually more appropriate to me than it ever would be to him. He says, what if I were giving a teaching, he says, and in the course of which is a Dharma activity, it's meant to be for the benefit of others. It's meant to reduce the delusions. But if the motivation for giving the teachings is to hear words of praise afterwards, oh, that was such a nice teaching, or you did such a good job, then the act of giving the teachings is contaminated with the 8 worldly dharmas, listening for praise. Rather than simply giving the teachings out of faith that the teachings themselves are the path to happiness and wishing others to experience that happiness and to be removed from their suffering, it becomes instead self-referential. In other words, what are they going to think about me? Like that. And it happens. It happens. Sitting here as a teacher, I know it happens. That if at the end of a teaching someone says, oh, that was really good, then I say, kind of like a little badge gets a little bit shinier, And if one says, I didn't really like the way you handled that question, I think you really missed the point, then, I can feel, ooh, yeah, that hurt. Right? It's very possible to feel that way, isn't it? So His Holiness is pointing out that when we're engaging in any of these activities, supposedly to enhance and give form to the compassionate bodhicitta motivation, we should try to make sure that we're not coming under the influence of the 8 worldly dharmas. Mm-hmm. There are other ways of commenting on these lines, but this is a very, very clear way of referring to them. Now, one thing that I would like to add here at this point is many of us have a tendency to use Dharma teachings as a stick to beat ourselves with. In other words, we read about what Buddha and the other great beings have done with their lives, the actions of the bodhisattvas, and we read about the faults of, let's say, the eight worldly dharmas, the eight worldly concerns, and selfishness and so forth. And then when we, one of the ways that we relate to those teachings is when we notice a fault in ourselves, when we notice that we're not living up to the ideal of these great bodhisattvas and Buddhas of the past, or that selfishness is present in our mind, or that we're doing something and we discover that our motivation is actually one of the eight worldly concerns. When we notice that, we tend to think, oh, this just reinforces what I always knew. You know, I'm worthless. I'm a bad person. I'm not a good Dharma practitioner. I'm bad. You know? And there's that tendency in many of us, maybe in all of us to some extent, and in some of us to a great extent, to use these teachings not as a way to build from strength to strength, but to convince ourselves that we have no strength at all. You know, that we are bad practitioners, bad people, like that. And I really encourage us, all of us, not to use the teachings that way. You know, in a sense, we're all beginners. You know, we're all trying to wean ourselves away from such things as the eight worldly dharmas and the ego-grasping ignorance and self-cherishing mind. But these things have been with us. You know, if we accept the teachings of the continuity of consciousness and rebirth, these things have been affecting our minds for a time without beginning. So of course, when we read about the activities of great bodhisattvas and the teachings of the Buddha and so forth, of course we're going to find areas that we fall short, where the habits of the past, the habits of these ingrained negativities, are going to be present. So using that as a reinforcement, I'm a bad person, is to kind of turn Dharma on its head. Because what Dharma is saying, ultimately, is that the essential nature of our mind, no matter how strongly the delusions arise, the essential nature is pure. It's only because it's been associated with the afflictive emotions, the delusions, and ignorance from which these delusions spring, it's only because it's been associated with this for such a long time that these habits, these negative habits arise in the field of our consciousness. But these arisals of negativities do not represent our authentic self, our authentic being. They are removable. And the whole aim of the Dharma is to remove them, is to help us remove them. So, for example, if we're doing an action and we note, for example, that I was meant to be doing this action selflessly, but actually I was hoping to receive something in return, like some praise or some ego strokes or something. If we notice that, then we can say, all right, there. The teachings have helped me identify the problem. Okay? So instead of feeling depressed, we feel a bit happy. You know, the problem isn't out there. The problem is right in that attitude. Okay? So now what do we do with it, having identified with it? We can do several things. One thing is we could depending on our strength and determination at that particular moment, we could say, all right, since I noticed that now, let me see if I can go 5 minutes without similar selfish, self-referential thoughts coming up. See if I can engage in an altruistic activity, keeping that at bay for 5 minutes. In other words, we could build up a strong positive habit in increments. That's one thing that we could do. Another thing that we could do is recognize, all right, this self-cherishing attitude that just popped up in my mind, quite clearly the cause of problems. I see that now. I didn't see it before, but I'm beginning to see now that this constant worry about I, me, mine is really at the very root of my problems. Okay. Right at this moment, in this world, are thousands, millions, billions of other beings who are completely under the sway of such a self-cherishing mind, are experiencing the suffering that comes from having such a mind, and see no alternative. They don't recognize that that's the problem. They're still feeling that the problems in their lives are external to themselves, that it doesn't come from such internal factors as the self-cherishing mind. So, while I'm experiencing it now, may it be sufficient to exhaust the self-cherishing, the suffering that comes from self-cherishing that other beings must experience. In other words, we use our own present weakness, if you want to call it that, to relate to the weakness affecting and the subsequent suffering affecting others. And we use a variation of that giving and taking meditation that we did last week. In other words, all right, I'm experiencing this self-cherishing and the suffering that comes from it. So we take on the suffering that other beings experience from their self-cherishing right in to that suffering, our own suffering, with the thought, may my experience of it exhaust it for others. And then when we breathe out, if we're doing it in combination with the breathing, or if we just mentally emanate, if we're doing it without specifically tying it together with the breathing meditation, as we give out the positive energy that comes from recognizing that the self-cherishing is actually the cause of problems, and that it's only by being concerned with others that we ourselves can be truly happy, then as we recognize that, then we give out the happiness to those very beings who are suffering from that self-cherishing. In other words, we use our own experience of suffering and the causes of suffering to link us with others to increase the power of our compassionate motive. In other words, we take our own weakness and we use it as a strength. Right? Doesn't mean the weakness itself is a strength, but by recognizing it and by linking it to the experience of others, we are widening the arena. We're no longer claustrophobic about our problems. That it's just my problem. That's just more I, me, mine going. Instead, we're saying, we're all in this boat together. I've just been fortunate enough to recognize that this is the problem. Other beings have exactly the same suffering. They don't recognize that it's a problem, so they just follow it without any qualms, without any investigation, without any thought that they're just miring themselves deeper into the problem. So with this way of thinking, even our own negativities, even our own weaknesses, alert us to the need for cultivating compassion for others. Right? And that's quite different from noting some weakness or negativity in ourselves and then becoming depressed by it. It's quite different. Lama Yeshe, I remember very clearly on several occasions, he would be giving teachings on certain vows that one can take. In this particular instance that I'm remembering, he was talking about the one-day vows, the 8 Mahayana precepts, which some people here may know about, where you take certain vows for a period of 24 hours. And then he asked kind of rhetorically, he says, well, what do you do if during those 24 hours you break one of those vows? Against things like lying or... there's a whole list of actions to avoid for those 24 hours. He says, so what do you do if you notice that, like for instance, in those list of 8 for that 24 hours, you avoid things like singing, unless it has unless it's part of a religious practice, but just kind of mindlessly humming a tune, you avoid that for that practice. So what do you do if you discover that you're just mindlessly humming a tune or singing, which happens? He says, well, there's 2 things you could do. You could beat yourself about it, you get really upset, or you could be really happy. And why happy? Because now, through the force of having taken the vow, you recognize some habit of your mind. I mean, normally you wouldn't recognize when you're engaged in one of these actions. Now, singing is kind of unusual because in and of itself it's not negative. It's only negative because for those 24 hours we're trying to use our body, speech, and mind to concentrate on the Dharma and cultivate compassion. So for kind of like mindless, engaging in sort of mindless behavior becomes negative only because of the vow one's taking. But what the vow has done is to make us more mindful of our behavior. So even if we know that we've done something that we vowed we wouldn't do, instead of being depressed by it, we say, now I notice. Now I notice an habit of my mind. And then, having noticed it, we apply the antidote, because there's always an antidote. For example, in the taking of the 8 Mahayana precepts, for example, there's a certain mantra that we recite. And then during the day, if we happen to break one of the precepts, one of the vows, we just recite that mantra several times as a way of cleansing that broken vow. And it's always true. There's no negative action that cannot be purified. Even the most heinous, even the most negative can be purified. All right? So if we realize that, then having our faults pointed out to us, either by ourselves or by others, is not the occasion for becoming really depressed, but it's an occasion for growth. So it's really a totally different attitude. Okay? Now, maybe I didn't have to go into that rant, but if anyone here has the kind of mind similar to mine, I feel very sorry for you. But things like that, I think, have to be said. Because Dharma isn't there to make us miserable. Dharma is there to make us happy. Make us feel good. Right? Feel fulfilled. So a Dharma practitioner shouldn't be someone who takes the teachings as a way of making himself or herself miserable. Okay, enough said. Now, the last 2 lines of this 8th stanza read like this: "And may I, recognizing all things as illusion, devoid of clinging, be released from bondage." Now, this is a different translation than the one that was printed out earlier and the one that's in your recommended reading. But because it seems to fit in the commentary better, I've chosen to include it here, and you'll get it, as I said, in the handout. So let me repeat those last 2 lines. "May I, recognizing all things as illusion, devoid of clinging, be released from bondage." Okay? So the key phrase here is recognizing all things as illusion. In some translations, they even say as like illusions, to be like illusions. Okay? This is, whenever we hear terms like this in the Buddhist teachings, illusion-like, dream-like, mirage-like, whenever we hear phrases like that, this indicates that we're now in the realm of the wisdom aspect of the teachings. Before, we've been concentrating on method, which means the cultivation of the compassionate motivation and all the activities, the various perfections that arise from that. But when we start speaking about seeing phenomena as if they were like illusions, like dreams, like mirages, now we are shifting into the wisdom aspect of the teachings. And remember, the path to enlightenment is said to be a union of method and wisdom. It's important to recognize when we come across a teaching like this, that the teachings are not saying that things are illusions. They're saying that they're like illusions. And that little word "like" has great meaning, great significance here. Right? It isn't as if this whole world is an illusion, and that someday we're going to wake up and things are going to be totally different from the way they appear now. Hmm. There's an element that that's true. But that's not the point being made here. Right? The point is that things don't exist the way they now appear to us. And in that way, they are like illusions. They're like illusions. So, the illusions that are being referred to in these teachings, I've discovered, I didn't know this in the beginning, but through receiving teachings over a period of time, I learned they're not just any illusions, though almost any illusions could be used as an example. Their rather specific one is in mind. Have you ever heard of the Indian rope trick? You ever hear of that? Indian rope trick? Anybody? Yeah? Okay. Well, what the kind of illusion is a magician's illusion. What's being referred to here, I'll try to give the experience as well as I can, as I understand it. Someone who is one of these master magicians is probably someone who has a skill in what we might call mass hypnosis. That they have very powerful spells or mantras, and also, together with certain skill and style of personality, that they can take something like a piece of wood, for example, and then recite a spell over it, recite a mantra over it, in such a way that it affects the minds of everybody in the room. And then, having affected their mind in that way, they can make it appear through the power of the mantra and so forth, through this kind of hypnotic ability. They can make it appear that, one example is that a rope goes up to heaven, and that the people in the audience see the magician or the magician's assistant climbing up and disappear up the rope. I've heard of people who've actually seen that, who've been present, when someone has created an illusion like that. Or another example is given that suddenly horses appear, dancing horses, and they put on a show. And the people are kind of mesmerized by this show. So this is a magician's illusion. In other words, a magician is creating something that other people perceive and take as being real. Okay? So I don't know how acceptable any of those examples are. So an example from my own experience, not perhaps quite as dramatic, is a number of years ago I had occasion to go to San Francisco and see the French mime Marcel Marceau. And anyone know Marcel Marceau? Right? And I used to always love to see him when he'd ever appear on television. And this time I had an occasion to see him in person. And there's one skit in which he creates like a dinner party. And there's nothing on the stage, absolutely nothing but him. Nothing else whatsoever. I don't even think there was music in this, just nothing. And he creates this ambiance of all of these people at a party. And after a while, you feel like you actually see them. And you even see the furniture, because at one point he leans back on the mantelpiece over the fireplace. And for a while, you kind of see it in your mind's eye. So in a sense, he's like a magician. He creates this illusion of there being a whole bunch of people experiencing this dinner party. Amazing. It's truly amazing. And so that's as close as I've ever gotten to the Indian rope trick. I've never seen dancing horses or, people climb up into the space. But I have seen the ability of someone to create an illusion which you then feel that you actually see it. Right? So we have that kind of experience in our life, probably. So we can maybe substitute that for this classic example. Well, but to go back to the classical example, there's an important reason for referring to it. If you were to ask someone in the audience what they saw, let's take the example of the dancing horses. They would say, I saw dancing horses appear. And you'd say, yeah, really? Were they there? He says, yeah, I saw them. They were right there. In other words, to such a person in the audience, the illusion appears and is taken as being real. Okay? There's two parts there. There's the appearance and the conception. This is very important. There's the appearance of the illusion, the appearance, let's say in this case, the appearance of the horses, and the belief or the conception that the horses are real. Right? Now, if you ask the magician what he saw, he also sees the horses. Why? Because he's present during the recitation of the mantras and the hypnosis, so it affects his mind as well. So he also sees the horses, right? But he has no conception, he has no belief in their reality. Why not? Because he knows he created them, right? So you can almost think of a someone, had one of these great studios, like Lucas's, what is that? Light and sound. What's that? Industrial Light and Magic. Yeah, right. Where they have all these special effects that they do for movies. When we see it, it really looks like, Spider-Man is climbing a building or something. But they know, well, this was done with a mat and this process and this process. So even though it still appears to their eyes as if these incredible events are happening, they know it's not real because they created it. They know the process that went into it. So the same thing for the magician. The horses appear, but without the conception that this is real. Okay? That's a very important distinction. The audience has the appearance of the reality and the belief in the reality. The magician has the appearance without the belief. Okay? Then, someone walks into the room after the spell has been spoken. To such a person, there's no appearance of the horse, right? There's no appearance. And, of course, without the appearance, there's no belief that there's a horse there. Without seeing it, you're certainly not going to believe that it's there. So those three describe progressive levels of spiritual development. That for ordinary beings, we believe things exist exactly as they appear to us. And I'll go in how they exist, I'll go into that a little bit more in a second. But however they appear, we believe that is their reality. So we're like members of the audience. As we gain further and further insight into the true nature of reality, or another way of putting it, the more we cultivate the wisdom of emptiness, removing all the false projections we have about this and that, then the first thing that gets removed is our belief that things exist the way they appear. They may continue to appear that way through the force of past habit and so forth, but we don't buy into that appearance. I think I heard that expression first in this context from Alan Wallace, a great Western teacher and translator, of buying into appearances. So we do have experiences in life where something happens to us and we know, I would have bought into it before, but I know better now. Right? So they're still having a certain appearance, but we're refraining from falling under the influence of that appearance. We don't buy into it anymore. A very mundane example comes to my mind. I'm sure we could think of much better ones as time goes on, but for instance, let's say there's somebody who has a very gruff and rough demeanor. And so in the beginning, whenever we see this person, we kind of feel a little bit turned off and think, oh, this person must be kind of a bad guy. Right? And so the appearance is of being kind of rough and tough, and the belief is this is really a rough, tough, not nice person. So the appearance and the belief go together. But after we get to know that person, we realize, well, that's just his manner. He's actually, a sweetie pie. He's a really nice guy. That's just the way he speaks, or it just reflects how he was brought up or something, or maybe his physical makeup maybe is responsible for his voice being that way and his demeanor being that way. But in reality, he's not like that. He has a very sweet, loving side to him. It's just a matter of looking past that outward appearance. So then, the next time we see that person, it still appears to be rough. The voice is still, low or grating or whatever it was, and the physical posture might be such that it gives that appearance of being a kind of a rough, tough character, but we no longer believe in it. In other words, we no longer assent to the appearance. Okay? So there's a distinction made. And what happened was a certain increase in wisdom. We looked under the surface and we saw some different reality. So now even when the old reality is still appearing to our eyes and so forth, we're not assenting to it with our mind. We're not buying into it. Okay? So is that distinction clear? And then at a higher state of development, a very high state of development, it's said to come only with Buddhahood itself, even the false appearance does not impinge upon our senses. In other words, even the appearance doesn't appear, right? There's no longer, it's not just simply a matter of not believing in the appearance, even the false appearance doesn't appear. Okay? So that's like the person who comes in after the spell has been spoken. Right. So now, by the way, as I was giving that example, what popped into my mind is Disney's cartoon, The Beauty and the Beast. Right? I mean, one could almost say that this is very largely the theme, or one of the main themes of that movie, is to look below appearances. Right? So you've got Gaston, who appears to be kind of handsome and stuff, but is completely foul underneath. And then you've got the Beast, who appears so loathsome and scary, but it's actually has something very pure underneath. Anyway, that's a nice example. So, we'll just go for a few more minutes before we take our break. So what is this appearance we're talking about? Okay. Now, first I should tell you what it's not. What the teachings are not saying is that this flower is a false appearance, and actually it's a rhinoceros. It's not saying that you've got one phenomenon that seems to exist as one thing, and that's wrong. It's actually something else. So we have to realize that that thing about the magician's illusion wasn't an example, it was an analogy. There's a big difference between an example and an analogy. In that analogy, what is in front of the person might be nothing but like a piece of wood. But through the force of the spell, the wood is now appearing as a dancing horse. So if you had the correct view, you would dispel the vision of the horse, and in its place you would have the piece of wood. Right? So that's just an analogy for how illusion works. Here we're not saying that this world of appearances, of this being a roof and this being a flower and this being a cup, that is incorrect, because in fact they are something else. This is not really a roof, this is not really a flower, this is not really a cup. That's not where these teachings are going. What these teachings are talking about is how these things exist, the nature of their existence. Not what they are, but how they exist. Okay? This is a very subtle point, and it's a very difficult one to recognize. Even after 30 years of trying to wrap my mind around it, it's elusive, it's slippery. It's very slippery. So you have to be patient with this. But what it's talking about is the manner in which things exist. So what is the false manner, the illusory manner in which things appear to exist? Separate. That's one word that's applied to it. Anything else? Things appear to be separate, unconnected. Solid. That's another word that's used. Separate and solid. Unchanging. Yes. Unchanging. Permanent. That's definitely one. Did I see a suggestion? Okay. Concrete is another word that's used, and in one of the quotations from the Dalai Lama, he uses it as well. Concrete. The most technically appropriate phrase that's used is things appear to be inherently existing. Inherently existing. And there are several synonyms for this. Inherently existing, existing from its own side. That's a phrase which is used. Existing from its own side. Okay. I've heard existing in its own right. Existing in its own right. Mm-hmm. Independently existing. Independently existing. And that gets to a lot of the words that were thrown out in the beginning, like separate and so forth. Independently existing. Okay. From the view of the highest school of Buddhist philosophy, all of these can be understood as synonymous. Okay. Tell you what, why don't we take a pause at this point just to chew that over a little bit, and then when we come back we'll have more to say about it. But because we have quite a bit of material to cover, even though it's only one word and 2 lines, let's try to make this break a shorter one rather than a longer one. So as close to 20 after as we can manage would be great.
Okay. All right.
Now, we've been talking many, many times in this course about the union of method, compassionate method, meaning bodhicitta, and the actions, such as the practice of the various perfections of a bodhisattva, of method, and wisdom, this union. There is another way of referring to these 2 aspects of the Mahayana path, of the Great Vehicle Path. And one is to refer to the former as conventional bodhicitta and the latter as ultimate bodhicitta. So when you hear conventional bodhicitta, we're referring about what we normally think of as the compassionate motivation and all of the actions that arise from that compassionate motivation. And that's the conventional bodhicitta, because it's called conventional because it's the bodhicitta that relates to conventional appearances. You know, ourselves as human beings involved in this world and with other human beings and all of the conventional appearances of this world. Then, wisdom is given the title here, in this context, ultimate bodhicitta. So here, ultimate bodhicitta is this understanding of a bodhisattva, you know, the being who has the bodhicitta, the understanding directed towards an analysis of the ultimate way in which things exist, under the surface of appearances, of ordinary appearances, the ultimate truth, the ultimate reality, which is emptiness, the lack of inherent existence. Okay? So sometimes you'll hear method and wisdom, sometimes you'll hear conventional bodhicitta and ultimate bodhicitta. But even though the different terms are being used, they are synonymous. Conventional bodhicitta is method, ultimate bodhicitta is wisdom. Okay? Existence. The absence of inherent existence. But I'm going to say more about that now. Also, I'd like to say that even though we have just a short amount of time, and this is only the last 2 lines of this particular verse, all of this serves as a bridge to the next module, which is cultivating the wisdom of emptiness, which, again, like this previous one, it will be 6 consecutive Tuesdays. So any of the things that are unclear here after tonight will be even more unclear after after 6 weeks of the next module. I can pretty much guarantee that. Okay? So there will be things that may be said here that we should just take as kind of signposts, or things to think about or hold on to, but that will require, of course, more explanation, more examples. All right? Because here, in the context of this the last two lines of the eighth stanza, the emphasis is on seeing things as being like illusions. That's really the concentration, and that is not the whole of the teachings on emptiness, but that's a very significant aspect of it, and concern stands for the teachings on emptiness. I'll try to explain that a little more. Okay. So, as I said, these teachings are talking about removing a wrong view, removing a mistaken view. But the mistaken view is not that something appears to be a pen, but it's actually a machine gun. It's not that we're mistaking one object for another object. That's not what's being referred to. That's not the way in which things are like illusions. Rather, it's that everything that appears to us, including our own self, including our own idea of who and what we are, all of these things appear through the force of this beginningless association with ignorance over beginningless lifetimes, appears to be self-existent. There's another synonym to the list I gave before. Appears to be self-existent, inherently existent, existing from its own side, independently existing in its own right. Or, to speak in maybe a slightly looser language, appears to be concrete, solid, independent. Okay? All of these are using words to try to point to the same thing. So this is something that takes quite a while, as I said, to wrap our mind around. But an example that might give us like a clue to what's being spoken about here is something that I've had occasion to refer to earlier. It's this, we see someone who appears in some kind of negative light in our eyes, and we think that is a bad person. So we think that quality of badness is inherent to the object. And even though we're talking about a person, it's still an object, isn't it? Right? It's an object of our conception, an object of our perception. So here's this person, in this case looking a lot like a little pen. Here's the person, and there has this attribute of badness which seems to be coming from the side of the object. Right? It doesn't seem, here we're talking on the level of appearances, right? It doesn't seem that bad quality, that repulsive, ugly, I don't like it quality, has anything to do with anything else, but seems to be coming from the side of the object itself, an inherently bad person. Okay? As we begin to investigate the situation much more deeply than that, we realize that appearance of badness is something which has been created by our mind using some clues, perhaps, some cues that come from the side of the object, like a scowling expression on the face, or an insult that this person once gave us, or could be any of a number of things. So there's some kind of, clue out there, but then based on that, our mind then projects a quality onto it from the outside. Okay? So we've spoken about this before in the course, in other contexts, in the context of developing the compassionate attitude of seeing other aspects of an object. Okay? So this is getting a bit closer to the idea of what inherent existence and non-inherent existence is all about. that from the false view, from the mistaken view of inherent existence, of self-existence, of independent existence, objects seem to have qualities from their own side. They seem to be self-sufficient. They're out there, solid unto themselves, and we just happen to be strolling along and perceiving them, bumping into them. It doesn't seem that the way their appearance has anything to do with our mind. Our mind just seems to be observing them, that's all. There's no sense here that the qualities that it's manifesting are, in a sense, a creation of our own mind, that they depend upon our own mind. They're just simply perceived by our mind. Okay? But the more we investigate, as I said, the more we recognize that what our mind has done is project certain qualities onto the object. It's almost as if the object were blank, like a blank screen, and that our mind is creating a picture there. And that's what we're relating to. Now, this is not at all the whole meaning of inherent existence, but it begins to give us a clue, a way of kind of getting into the teachings in a more comfortable way. Because the teachings actually go far beyond that. They not only say that these attributes of the object, its apparent goodness and badness, exists only in dependence upon the viewing consciousness, or in a sense a creation or projection of our own mind. It goes beyond that to say the very fact that it appears as a person or a pen or a flower or a microphone, the fact that this world appears the way it does, is also exists only in dependence upon the mind itself. This is much more subtle. But the same basic idea is at work, that the false view identifies the qualities as coming solely from the side of the object. The unmistaken view recognizes the extent to which the appearance depends upon the coming together of many factors, including the conceiving consciousness. In other words, the mind's conceptions. Right? So again, we're coming to the point that we're living in a mentally conditioned universe. The reason why certain things appear to us the way they do is a function of many factors, including our own consciousness. Okay? This is a subtle point. And even within a Buddhist philosophy, there's many levels of understanding of this. Right? So, again, we should be patient with ourselves as we try to get closer and closer understanding. Mm-hmm. Now, I want to offer up two images which may be helpful in pursuing this a little bit further. One image is we're walking along, and you can try, if you can, you might try to imagine this, and there's a shape in the distance, but it's too far away to make out exactly what it is, but it looks very much like a person. And we become convinced, in fact, that it is a person, until we're so close that we realize it's a shape, it's kind of like a pile of rocks, next to a tree, which just happens to be close enough to the shape of a person for us to mistake it. Okay? So as we're walking closer, let's kind of try to get into that frame of mind that we're approaching this object. We hold in our mind the thought, that is a person. That's a person that I'm approaching. And we could even start adopting certain attitudes. Like if we're in a strange area that we've never been to before, we might wonder, is that a robber? Is that someone who's going to harm me? Or if we're in an area where we know that our friends live, is that somebody that I'm looking forward to seeing? We might find ourselves going towards that object either with great reluctance and fear or with great anticipation, thinking it's a person. And thinking on top of that, it's not only a person, it may be the friendly person or an unfriendly person, okay? So in other words, our mind is holding on to the existence, to the reality of this being a person in front of us, okay? Now, as we get closer, and in some cases we might have to get very, very close, we recognize we were mistaken. You know, we were misled by the appearance, and then it's actually just a pile of rocks in a tree, for example. Right? At that moment, the moment we recognize that, the belief that we had in the person evaporates, disappears, in a sense becomes empty, right? We can't hold on to it any longer. Why? Because we see for ourselves, upon closer investigation, that there was no such person there. It was only a formation of rocks and tree and so forth. Okay? So, now, if we were to continue on in our journey and then look back over our shoulders, for a second it might appear again that there's a man standing there. But then we remember, oh, I already investigated that. That's just a pile of rocks in a tree. Right? So the appearance might reassert itself for a moment. It could. But the belief that that's a person can no longer reassert itself because we've done the investigation. Okay? So that second time, let me backtrack for a second. The first time we're approaching this object, whatever it is, it doesn't seem to merely appear to be a person. We think it really is a person. So there's no question there of there being an illusion involved. The second time, because we've done our investigation, we've got close enough to see that it's rocks in a tree, the second time when we look, again, we might have the appearance of the person, but now we immediately recognize that appearance was a mere illusion. It's an illusory appearance. Okay? Because I've investigated, and I know there's no such thing as a person there. Now, in traditional examples, they use the mirage, where first we think that shimmering object in the distance, kind of in the desert that we're walking through, is actually a lake. But when we investigate, we realize there's nothing there but sand and sunlight. And so even later, as we're resuming our journey and we see the lake again, we say that appearance of a lake is just a mirage, which is another way of saying it's an illusion. It's an illusory appearance, okay? That is really just sand and sunlight, giving that shimmering appearance, that mirage-like appearance. So there may be an appearance of water, just as there was the appearance of the man, but there's no longer a belief in the actual existence of a real person or a real body of water. Okay? This indicates two phases in the meditation on emptiness. One phase is when we do investigation and we discover things don't have inherent existence. You know, that's like discovering that man was really a false appearance on some rocks in a tree, or that the lake was just a false appearance on heat and sand. Okay? So at those moments that the illusory object is seen, as the appearing object disappears, you know, the man poofs. You know, we no longer see the man, right? We no longer believe. That's a better way of putting it. We no longer believe there's a man there, or we no longer believe there's a body of water there. The idea that we had in our head, there's a man or there's a body of water, that idea poofs out of existence, becomes empty. That is the equivalent to the first phase of meditation, the first phase of the investigation of emptiness, which is in the meditative state. the space-like experience of emptiness. In other words, before there was something that seemed so solid and concrete and separate, like to use the words that were thrown out in the beginning, or inherently existent or independently existent, to use the more technical language. And then when we investigate, we see that there's no such thing there. And in our meditation, the previous conception that we had disappears. Okay? So it's like space. It's said to be like space. Okay? And there are very powerful meditation practices where you visualize something as being very solid, and then in the process of investigating it, you can imagine it almost exploding into its kind of molecular and atomic components until there's nothing left. So what seemed to be so solid and concrete and out there, through the process of investigation, is seen to be transparent. Okay? So it's like space. It's said to be like space. Because what is space? It's just the absence of a tangible, solid, obstructing object. Right? So if this fist that I'm holding up were to suddenly disappear, then in the space where the fist was, there was just space. So it's said to be a space-like realization. And this occurs when we're cultivating the wisdom of emptiness. This occurs in the meditation session. We bring to mind some object, we investigate the object using many various approaches and lines of logic until we recognize that the object that we were holding on to never existed in the first place. Just as the body of water out there in the desert, and just as that person on the trail never existed. It wasn't as if there were a body of water there or a man there, and that when we investigated the object or the person disappeared. No. What we discover is there never was such an object there in the first place. So here, when we hold on to some object as being inherently existent, and then through the force of investigation, we see that it's non-inherently existent, that it doesn't exist from its own side, the way it appears, and that it never existed. It was just a mistaken conception of our own mind that thought it existed. Then that previous so-called object disappears into space. So in the meditation practice, it becomes like the space-like meditation on emptiness. One example that we're going to explore a lot more in the next module is the most important object to investigate, and that is ourself. Right? And as we've talked about before on various occasions, when we refer to ourselves, like even as I just did just then, I touched part of the body. and I kind of touched it in the area where the mind is felt to dwell. So even by the gesture, when I talk about myself, I'm indicating some activity that has something to do with the body, something to do with the mind, something to do with a combination of body and mind. Okay? Or as in more traditionally Buddhist terminology, something to do with these 5 aggregates. The first aggregate being form, body, and the other 4 aggregates having to do with various qualities of consciousness or mind. So whichever way you divide up the pie, the self is something which exists somehow in relationship to this body-mind aggregation. Okay? All right. So when someone insults you in front of a group of people, and you think, how dare that person insult me? I feel so embarrassed. Right? Then who's embarrassed? Who's the I? Who's the me being referred to? Well, at that moment, we don't think that person is insulting my body or that person is insulting my mind. We think that person's insulting me. Right? So at that moment, a sense of self arises which seems to be independent of the body and mind which serve as its basis. Okay? This is especially true in moments of strong emotion, either positive or negative. We hold on to a conception of self which appears to, it appears in so many different ways, it's hard to put language around it. We can say it's independent of body and mind, or it hovers over it somewhere, or it's a kind of a solid lump inside it somewhere, right? But there's a certain sense of me as being separate from this body-mind combination. Even our language reflects this, right? Because we say, someone asks us, how do you feel this morning? And you say, well, my body doesn't feel so good, but my mind is pretty happy. So then, what are we saying? My body, the body belonging to me, okay? We're not saying the body's body, we're saying my body. So there's some entity called me or my or I, which is over here, which possesses this body. And a same entity, separate entity, possessing my mind. Otherwise, I would say the mind's mind. I wouldn't say my mind. Right? So in other words, we intuitively feel that this body, this mind, this body-mind combination belongs to, or is the possession of, or is ruled by I. Okay? All right. That means the I, or the me, is somehow or other separate from what it owns. If I say I own a Honda, it doesn't mean I am the Honda, right? Doesn't make any sense. The Honda belongs to me, okay? So if I speak about my mind or my body, just even on a linguistic level, it seems that the body or mind belongs to this other entity called me, right? That's a kind of a linguistic approach. But what's more important is not just to approach it linguistically, but, from the gut, from the heart. Because when we're in the thralls of a strong emotion, that sense of an independent, separate, inherently existing I comes to the fore very, very strongly. Okay? It's especially present in moments of great hatred, great desire. Okay? Very present. Right? This is not just happening to some vague concept of I, it's happening to me. Right? And we get really upset or really excited, depending on whether it's a positive or a negative experience. Okay? So, in wisdom meditation, in this analysis, what's called searching for the I, we start out with this strong sense, the strong conception of such a solid, independent I, something which is conceived of as being quite separate from the body and mind which serves as its basis of reference. Okay? So then what do? We investigate. We get closer to it. Like the person who walks up to the tree and the rocks to see what's really there. Or walks up in the direction of the so-called body of water to see what, is that really water there? Can I take a drink from it? No, it's just sand. Okay? In other words, we get closer to the object. We begin with part of our mind, we hold on to that conception of self, and with the other part of the mind, we begin to investigate it from as many different angles as possible. And many of the great Indian masters who followed from Buddha refined techniques of investigation. And at some point in the investigation, we discover the unfindability of the object. Right? That thing that we had in mind to search for is seen to be non-existent. And it might seem that, I did have a sense of I before. It was real, but when I investigated it, it became unreal. There was really water out in the desert. It's only when I looked for it that it disappeared. Right? Well, that's wrong. It never existed. Okay? But through the force of appearances, it's going to appear again and again and again. Right? So, two phases in the process. One is to investigate to see the non-existence of the non-existent object. To see that the object which was conceived to be inherently existent, independently existent, existing from its own side, existing from its own right, any of those synonyms, right? That object not only doesn't exist, but never existed. Okay? So that's the first phase, and that takes place in meditation. So in meditation, it leads to this space-like realization of emptiness. But what happens after the meditation process? After the meditation process, when we're no longer doing that kind of close investigation, then things reappear. There's this song from the 60s by Donovan, and I'm sure the lines of the poem were not original from him. I'm sure they come from an older source. First there is a mountain, then there is no mountain, then there is. Anyone remember that song? Okay. Well, that can be, interpreted in many ways. But from this point of view of these teachings, first there is a mountain. There's this apparent, solid, concrete, independent thing over there. Then, through the force of analysis, that mountain, the one we were holding on to in our mind that seems so solid, is seen not to exist that way at all. So there is no mountain. And then, later, the mountain reappears, and then there is. Okay, reappears, but we no longer hold on to it with that same sense of solidity in which it first appeared. Okay, so this is the kind of a progress of this type of meditation. So in the post-meditation session, having touched on the experience of emptiness in the meditation session, then when things appear, they're taken to be like illusions. In other words, they're like that body of water out in the desert, or that apparent man on the trail, or the appearance of the horse for the magician's illusion. But they're not taken to be existing in the way that they appear. They're appearing, they're still appearing, but they're no longer held to exist the way they appear, to have that kind of solid, concrete appearance. Then the Dalai Lama, after talking about this for a while, he says, and I'll quote from here, and you'll get this at the end of the class. He says, "What is the benefit of understanding that things are empty of existing the way they appear?" What's the benefit of understanding that things are empty of existing the way they appear? And his answer is, our afflictive emotions, which is just another term for our delusions, our afflictive emotions of desire, hatred, and so forth arise because we superimpose upon phenomena a goodness and badness beyond which they actually have. In other words, it's holding onto things to be so self-existent, so inherently existent, to exist in the solid, concrete way that they appear. It's our holding on to that which gives rise to the afflictive emotions, to the delusions. Without that first assenting to that appearance of concreteness and solidity, then the strength of those delusions would be diminished or eradicated, depending on that. Of course, depends on the extent of our familiarity with that meditation. Okay? So then the Dalai Lama goes on to say, for instance, when we get very angry or desirous, we have during that time a strong sense of the goodness or badness of that object. But later, when these emotions calm down and we look at the same objects, we ourselves will even find our early perception laughable. And that happens. That's right. That actually happens. We look back and say, what was I thinking? I was completely thought things were one way, and I so much thought they were that way that I became really nervous, really upset, really elated, really depressed, really this, really that. For what? It was an illusion. There was really nothing there that corresponded to my thought. I don't want to say there was nothing there. we're not falling into the extreme of nihilism to say that this is a world of nothing. Things exist, but they don't exist in that way, in that inherently existent, self-existent, concrete, independent way that they're appearing to our mind now. So, to quote Dalai Lama one more time to bring this to an end, the benefit or assistance of wisdom, this analysis, this investigation of wisdom, is that it prevents us from superimposing on objects a goodness or badness beyond what is actually there, whereby we are able to stop desire and hatred. The whole point of meditating on the ultimate nature of reality is to ensure that you are not fooled by appearances. You will be aware that things are not as substantial and solid as they seem. So, one way that appears in many formulations in Buddhism, what can I refer to it as? One style of expression that's very often used is to refer to the three spheres of emptiness, which I've written up there, the three spheres of emptiness. So, for example, we're reaching the end of this course, so what we do at the end of course is always dedicate whatever meritorious energy we've generated for the attainment of enlightenment. Okay? So, that activity of dedicating meritorious energy for the benefit of others, okay, there's an activity. There's a bodhicitta-generated activity, right? Okay? So you can take that activity as you can take any activity and recognize that it's composed of three spheres. And they can be understood slightly differently depending on the context, but we can think of it as the actor, the act, and the acted upon. So for instance, I'm going to dedicate the merit of this session for the happiness of my brother who's upset with me right now. Okay? So that's my dedication. That's my individual dedication. So what are the three spheres? There's I, the person who's doing the dedication. Right? There's the dedication itself, the meritorious energy that's been created. And then there's the dedicatee, the person who's receiving the dedication. In this case, my brother who's probably upset with me. Okay? I had a kind of a nasty phone call just before I came to class. One of the reasons I was a little bit late. Okay? So, and what made it worse is he was actually right. No, much, much older. So, centuries older. So anyway, so there's these three spheres of that action. The I as the actor, the dedication of merit as the act itself, and then the person who's receiving the dedication, the acted upon. Sometimes, depending on the action, it doesn't fall into those three categories, but it can always be divided into three spheres. Any activity we engage in always has three spheres. Okay? So, it is said that a perfect dedication of energy is to recognize that these three spheres of dedication, or three spheres of any action, doesn't have to be dedication, any action whatsoever, are empty of inherent existence. So, who am I who is making this dedication? That I itself, this sense of self, I'm not saying that I don't exist. If I don't exist, who are you guys listening to? Right? So I exist, but the I doesn't exist in the solid, concrete way it's appearing. It's not inherently existing. And the merit that's being dedicated, it exists, but it is not a solid, independent, concrete, inherently existing thing. And the person it's being dedicated to, like in this case, let's say my brother, for example, is also not an inherently existing person. Not to say he doesn't exist, he exists, but he exists non-inherently. Okay? Not in that solid, concrete, independent way that ignorance is conceiving him to exist. Not in the way that it appears through the because of the influence of past ignorance and so forth. Okay? So that is said to dedicate energy, or to look at any object, to look at the three spheres of any action as being empty, is said to be an excellent way, the most excellent way of engaging in any activity. So, for instance, here we are kind of would-be bodhisattvas, trying to practice the path leading to enlightenment, but without holding on to ourselves as being solid, concrete actors, independent, self-existent bodhisattvas. Okay? We try to remove that false vision from our concept of self. And then any help or benefit that we engage in, we try to see that that too is a dependent arising. It's not inherently existing. It's not independently existing. And whatever we're dedicating it to, whether it be the long life of our gurus, or the health and welfare of some individual, or whatever it might be, that object also lacks inherent existence. Okay? So in this way, we come back to seeing things as being like illusions, not actual illusions. It's not as if there's something else. They exist in some other way. They appear to be inherently existent, concretely, independently existent, but in fact, they are dependent arisings. And that phrase, dependent arising, is the flip side of emptiness. The way things don't exist is independently. The way they do exist is as dependent arisings. So much of what we have to say in the upcoming course on emptiness will also be talking about dependent arising, because they are two, we could almost say that they're two sides of the same coin. Okay? So, the Buddha's teachings were not written down for approximately 400 years after the passing of the Buddha, but were memorized and passed on until eventually in Sri Lanka and Ceylon they were first committed to writing. And because of the power of memorization of these great early practitioners, and because of the fact that the teachings themselves were often given in a very rhythmic language, which you can see for yourselves when you read the various sutras or discourses, that there was extraordinary accuracy, this ability to hold in memory and then to pass on as an oral tradition these teachings. In fact, when we confront pre-literate societies, even nowadays, often we find that they hold whole epics of their tribe or their nation without writing. They hold it in their mind and passed it down uncorrupted from generation to generation. For us in a literate age, it seems like a miracle, or it seems like a fairy tale that anyone could memorize such vast amounts of material. But in fact, that was the case. When Buddha was addressing his closest disciples, particularly his cousin Ananda, who was his closest attendant for so many years, he said, when you remember the teachings that I give, in general, it's enough that you get the idea correct. I'm paraphrasing the Buddha. He had a much more elegant way of putting it. Okay, right? He says, but when it comes to my teachings on emptiness, in other words, the wisdom teachings, even if you get one word wrong, you're not repaying my kindness. Right? And this is a very, very significant statement by the Buddha, because he recognized how difficult it is for us to see things in any way other than the way they appear to us now, in a solid, concrete way. So the teachings on emptiness, which represent an investigation to discover that things exist in a way totally different from the ordinary way in which they appear, these teachings are extremely precious and precise. And so it is with a great deal of caution and not a little trepidation that I even think to repeat these teachings. It would be much different if they were coming from a place of realization. Then I could have figured that whatever came out mirrored that realization and would be correct. But I'm more like a parrot or a tape recorder here. And the tape recorder's not functioning at the level of accuracy that the early transmitters of the Buddhist teachings did when they were able to pass on for 400 years the uncorrupted teachings. So, as we dedicate the merit of the time that we've spent together over these past 6 weeks or so, then let us do so with a recognition that if anything has been said here that does not accord with the ultimate intention of the Buddha and the great masters who followed, who revealed the actual meaning of emptiness within the context of dependent arising, then let that misunderstanding be no more substantial in our minds than a finger writing in water, leaving no impression. And may any of those false impressions in the future be completely eliminated by cultivating the wisdom of listening to and thinking about and meditating upon the true teachings of emptiness within the context of dependent arising, just as Buddha and the great masters such as Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti and Aryadeva and Shantideva and Atisha and Jetsunkopa and all our great teachers have expressed, so that we can actually rid ourselves not merely of these misconceptions of inherent existence, but more importantly, the crippling delusions of hatred, attachment, jealousy, arrogance, doubt, fear, and all the other negativities which bring suffering to ourselves and to others. So just as the Buddhas of the past, present, and future, and their glorious sons and daughters, the Bodhisattvas, have dedicated, are dedicating, and will continue to dedicate the merit of their virtuous actions, then, if anything that we've done here, either individually or collectively, is even in the slightest nature virtuous and positive, may we dedicate that meritorious energy with a realization of the void and empty nature of the three spheres, so that all beings may be removed from their mental and physical sufferings, so as His Holiness the Dalai Lama and all our gurus of all traditions, revealing true paths to happiness, higher rebirth, liberation, and enlightenment, may have long and fruitful lifetimes, so that we may come under their benevolent care in this and in all future states of existence, so that the enlightened beings inhabiting every corner of the universe continue to turn the peerless wheel of the Dharma, and that we ourselves may quickly attain enlightenment, the fulfillment of our own enlightened potential as quickly as possible in order to repay the infinite kindness we've received from each and every being. And finally, may all of those who come to this place, the land of Medicine Buddha, in search of mental, physical, or spiritual health and well-being, may they have their wishes fulfilled just as they desire. Then there's a concluding prayer, which, if you know, you can recite along with me in Tibetan. If not, the meaning of the prayer is, by this virtuous merit, may we attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead each and every being, without exception, into that enlightened state. And may the precious bodhicitta mind that has not yet been born in me, may it arise and grow, and may that bodhicitta which has arisen never decrease, but only increase forevermore. Gewandi nyun tu dan lama sangye drun kyo ne droa chi kyang malu pai gengi sala ungbar sho changjub sem chok rinpoche manke apanam genkyo chik Gyempan yampa me pa yang gong ne gong tu pel ban shu. So, thank you everyone.